The bullet missed her skull by 3 inches. Sergeant Yura Okonkwo pressed her body flat against the rocks as dust erupted where her head had been half a second before. Somewhere out there in the Afghan darkness, an enemy marksman was hunting her. And somewhere behind her, 620 Marines were dying because their commanding officer had given an order that made no tactical sense. She had 14 hours to fix what Captain Aldrich Vance had broken. 14 hours to cross 2 kilometers of enemy-held terrain, eliminate a Taliban commander named Qasim Rashidi, and create an escape corridor for men who had already been written off as acceptable losses. The brass back at command would call it desertion. They would say she abandoned her post. But Yara had learned something in her 10 years wearing the uniform that men like Vance would never understand. Sometimes the only way to honor your oath is to break your orders. Before we go any further, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from today. Maybe you have military families in your area, or maybe you have witnessed the kind of courage we are about to explore in this story. 6 hours earlier, forward operating base Thunderhawk had been quiet. Yara remembered the stillness of the morning, the way the mountains caught the first light and turned the color of dried blood. She had been cleaning her M40A6 when Lance Corporal Dmitry Resnick dropped onto the sandbags beside her, his spotter scope hanging from his neck like a talisman. "You hear about the patrol?" he said. It was not a question. Yara kept her eyes on the rifle. She had heard. 2nd Platoon was heading into the valley at 0530. Standard route. Standard formation. The kind of routine that got men killed in Helmand Province. Resnick scratched at the stubble on his jaw. Vance approved the route himself. Same path we used last week, and the week before that. She did not respond. There was nothing to say that would not end with her standing at attention in front of a man who had made it clear from his first day at Thunderhawk that he did not believe women belonged in combat roles. Certainly not as scout snipers. Certainly not making tactical recommendations to officers who had graduated from West Point while she had been learning to shoot on the south side of Chicago with a rifle her uncle had bought from a pawn shop. The thing about Yara Okonkwo that most people did not understand was that she had never once in her life asked for permission to be extraordinary. She had simply done the work. She had qualified for Scout Sniper School when 17 men in her class had washed out. She had broken a 20-year accuracy record held by an instructor who had tried to fail her for improper weapon maintenance that 3 other Marines had witnessed her completing perfectly. She had appealed. She had won. And she had spent every day since then proving that the uniform did not care what was underneath it. Resnick pulled a protein bar from his pocket and broke it in half, offering her the larger piece. She took it. This was their ritual. He talked. She listened. Somehow it worked. "Your brother is on that patrol," he said. Yara's hand stopped moving across the rifle barrel. Private First Class Tobias Okonkwo, 22 years old, her mother's last child, born when Yara was already 6 and certain she would never have to share her parents with anyone. She had been wrong about that. She had been wrong about resenting him too. Tobias had followed her into the Marines against her explicit instructions, against their mother's tears, against every argument Yara could construct about why he should go to college instead and become something safe like an accountant or a teacher. He had looked at her with their father's stubborn eyes and said that if she could serve, so could he. She had wanted to strangle him. She had also never been prouder of anyone in her life. "I know," she said. Resnick nodded. He did not offer comfort. Comfort was not something either of them traded in. Instead, he said, "I ran the terrain analysis again last night. That valley is a kill box. 3 elevated positions with clear sight lines. If someone wanted to set up an ambush, they could not design a better location." "Did you tell Vance?" "I told his aide, Lieutenant Carpenter. He said the captain had reviewed all relevant intelligence and determined the route was secure." Yara felt something cold settle in her chest. Relevant intelligence. The phrase sounded like something from a briefing document, the kind of language that men used when they wanted to sound authoritative without actually knowing anything. She had seen officers like Vance before, men who believed that rank was the same thing as competence, men who confused following procedure with making good decisions. She touched the brass casing that hung on a thin chain around her neck. It was a habit she had developed years ago, a small ritual that reminded her why she did this work. The casing had come from her first confirmed kill. A Taliban fighter who had been lining up a shot on a 19-year-old Marine who did not even know he was about to die. That Marine had been Tobias. His first deployment, his first firefight, and Yara had been watching from 800 meters away when she saw the enemy rifle swing toward her brother's back. She had not hesitated. She had not asked for permission. She had simply done what needed to be done. The sound of rotors pulled her attention skyward. A Black Hawk was coming in from the east, probably carrying supplies, or maybe another officer who would spend 3 days at Thunderhawk before rotating back to somewhere with air conditioning and hot food. Yara watched it descend toward the landing zone and thought about what Resnick had said. Kill box. 3 elevated positions. And her brother walking straight into it, because a man with a West Point ring had decided that routine was more important than survival. She should have said something. She should have walked into Vance's office and laid out every piece of tactical data that made this patrol a death sentence waiting to happen. But she knew exactly how that conversation would end. At 05:15, Yara watched 2nd Platoon form up near the motor pool. 43 Marines in full combat gear, checking weapons, trading jokes, doing all the things that men did when they were about to walk into the unknown. She found Tobias near the back of the formation, his helmet slightly crooked the way it always was because he had never quite learned to wear it properly. He caught her looking and raised one hand in a wave that was almost a salute. She nodded back. There were things she wanted to say. Be careful. Stay low. Come back to me. But the words would not come, and even if they had, saying them out loud would have felt like admitting that something might go wrong. 15 minutes later, the patrol rolled out through the main gate. Yara watched until the dust had settled and the sound of engines had faded into the mountain silence. Then she picked up her rifle and headed for the overwatch position on the ridge, where she and Resnick would spend the next 8 hours watching and waiting and hoping that she was wrong about everything. She was not wrong. The first explosion came at 05:47. Yara was still setting up her position when the sound reached her, a deep thundering boom that rolled across the valley like the voice of something ancient and angry. She pressed her eye to the scope and saw smoke rising from the convoy's position. Then the gunfire started, not scattered shots, not the disorganized crackle of a chance encounter. This was coordinated. This was planned. This was exactly the ambush that Resnick had predicted and Vance had ignored. Yara began counting muzzle flashes. 1 position on the northern ridge, 2 more on the southern slope, a 4th concealed in the rocks near the valley floor. They had the patrol surrounded. They had planned this perfectly, and somewhere in that chaos, her brother was fighting for his life. She made her first shot at 05:49. The Taliban fighter on the northern ridge dropped and did not move again. By 0600, she had confirmed 6 kills, but it was not enough. It would never be enough, because while she was picking off enemies one by one, more kept appearing from positions she had not even identified. And back at Thunderhawk, the alarm sirens were screaming, which meant the base itself was under attack. Then came the order that changed everything. All units, this is Vance. Fall back to FOB interior. Repeat, fall back to interior positions. We are sealing the perimeter. Resnick grabbed her arm. He is trapping them out there. If he seals the perimeter, the patrol cannot get back inside. Yara understood. She understood perfectly. Vance was sacrificing 43 Marines to protect the base. He was writing them off. And among those 43 Marines was a 22-year-old private with a crooked helmet who had followed his sister into the uniform because he believed in something bigger than himself. For a long moment, she did not move. She thought about duty. She thought about orders. She thought about everything the Corps had taught her about chain of command and military discipline and following the lawful instructions of superior officers. Then she thought about Tobias. Sergeant, Resnick said, "What we doing?" Yara Okonkwo stood up from her position, checked her ammunition, and looked toward the enemy lines that stood between her and 620 Marines who had just been left to die. "We are breaking protocol," she said, and she began to move. The first 200 meters were the worst. Yara moved through terrain that offered almost no cover, her body pressed so low to the ground that the rocks scraped against her chest with every crawl. Behind her, the sounds of Thunderhawk under siege echoed across the valley. Explosions, gunfire, the distant screams of men who had woken up that morning thinking today would be routine. Ahead of her, the enemy positions formed a crescent of death that she would have to pass through if she wanted to reach the trapped patrol. Resnick's voice crackled in her earpiece. Okonkwo, I have eyes on you. You have 3 tangos at your 11 o'clock, maybe 200 meters out. They are not looking your way yet. Copy, she whispered. She had left him at the overwatch position with strict instructions. Keep providing cover fire. Keep Vance thinking she was still at her post. Buy her as much time as possible before anyone realized what she was actually doing. Resnick had not argued. He had simply nodded and said something in Ukrainian that she suspected was either a prayer or a curse. Possibly both. The 3 tangos Resnick had spotted were crouched behind a rock formation, their attention focused on the kill zone where the patrol was pinned down. Yara could see their silhouettes against the lightning sky. Young men, probably. Farmers or shepherds before the war had given them rifles and a cause. She did not let herself think about that. She could not afford to see them as anything other than obstacles between her and her brother. She lined up the first shot. Breathe out. Squeeze the trigger. The man dropped without a sound. His companions spun toward the noise, confusion written in their body language. They had expected the sniper fire to come from the ridge, not from ground level, not from a position that should have been impossible to reach. That confusion cost them 3 seconds. 3 seconds was all Yara needed. 2 more shots. 2 more bodies. She was already moving before the last one hit the ground. Resnick's voice again. Clean work. But you just announced your position to everyone in a half-mile radius. You need to relocate fast. Already moving. She scrambled over a low rise and dropped into a dry stream bed that wound through the valley like a scar. The stream bed would give her cover for maybe 400 meters before it curved back toward the enemy's main position. 400 meters of relative safety. After that, she would be in the open again. The radio chatter from Thunderhawk was getting worse. She could hear Vance's voice cutting through the chaos, issuing orders that sounded confident but meant nothing. Reinforce the eastern wall. Pull back from Sector 7. Hold the motor pool at all costs. He was thinking about the base. Only the base. The 43 Marines in the valley had already been erased from his calculations. Yara thought about the first time she had met Aldrich Vance. 3 months ago, when he had arrived at Thunderhawk with pressed uniforms and a handshake that felt like a political gesture. He had looked at her service record and asked if she had really qualified as a scout sniper or if someone had made a clerical error. She had said nothing. She had learned long ago that men like Vance did not change their minds based on words. They only changed their minds based on results. And sometimes not even then. Gunnery Sergeant Marisol Delgado had pulled her aside after that first meeting. Do not let him get under your skin, Mija. Men like that, they are everywhere. You outlast them by being too good to ignore. Delgado was probably fighting for her life right now. The thought made Yara move faster. She was halfway through the stream bed when the first rays of real sunlight broke over the mountains. The light was both a blessing and a curse. She could see better now, but so could the enemy. Every shadow she had been using for concealment was shrinking by the minute. She needed to reach the far side of the valley before full daylight turned her into an easy target. The stream bed curved and she followed it, her rifle cradled against her chest, her eyes scanning constantly for movement. She passed the body of a Taliban fighter who had been caught in the initial exchange. He looked younger than Tobias. She did not stop. Okonkwo. Resnick's voice was tighter now. I am picking up radio traffic. Enemy frequency. They know someone is moving through their perimeter. They are sending a search team. How many? 8, maybe 10, coming from the northwest. She calculated distances and angles. The search team would reach the stream bed in approximately 6 minutes. She needed to be gone before then, but the only exit from the stream bed was an open stretch of rocky ground that would leave her completely exposed. Resnick, she said, I need a distraction. A pause. Then, I could put some rounds into the rocks near their position. Make them think the sniper is still on the ridge. Do it. She waited. 30 seconds later, she heard the crack of Resnick's rifle and the distant ping of bullets striking stone. The radio chatter she could not understand suddenly increased in volume and urgency. The search team was redirecting toward the ridge, toward a threat that was not actually there. Yara broke from the stream bed and ran. She covered the open ground in under a minute, her lungs burning, her legs pumping against terrain that seemed designed to trip her with every step. A bullet cracked past her head, then another. Someone had spotted her. She dove behind a boulder and pressed herself against the cold stone, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. Resnick, I am taking fire. I see it. Shooter on the southern slope, 900 meters. He is good. He almost had you. Can you take him? Negative. Angle is wrong from my position. You are on your own. She processed this information without emotion. On her own. The phrase had defined most of her life. Growing up on the south side of Chicago with a father who worked double shifts and a mother who had taught her that waiting for someone to save you was a good way to end up dead. Joining the Marines at 18 because college was not an option and the recruiter had been the first person to look at her like she might actually be capable of something. Fighting through sniper school, surrounded by men who wanted her to fail, who bet money on how long she would last, who went silent one by one as she outperformed them on every metric that mattered. On her own. Fine. She had been on her own before. She studied the slope where the shooter was positioned. 900 meters. Difficult shot, but not impossible. The problem was that taking the shot would mean exposing herself again, and this time the shooter would be ready. Unless she could change the angle. She spotted a cluster of rocks 20 meters to her left. If she could reach them, she would have a clear line of sight to the southern slope. The shooter would not expect her to move toward the threat. It was counterintuitive. It was dangerous. It was exactly the kind of decision that separated good snipers from great ones. Yara took a breath, touched the brass casing at her throat, thought about Tobias. Then she ran. The bullets started before she had covered 5 meters. She felt one tug at her sleeve, heard another whine past her ear. The rocks seemed impossibly far away, a lifetime of open ground that she would never survive. But her legs kept moving. Her body refused to stop. And then she was diving, rolling, coming up behind the stone cluster with her rifle already rising to her shoulder. She found the shooter in her scope. He was repositioning, trying to track her new location. For one heartbeat, their eyes almost met across 900 meters of Afghan morning. Then Yara fired. The shooter fell. She lay there for a moment, breathing hard, sweat running down her face despite the cold. The radio in her ear had gone silent. She tapped it once, twice. Resnick. Kumin. Nothing. Resnick, respond. Static. Then a burst of noise that might have been gunfire or might have been interference. Then nothing at all. Yara Okonkwo was alone. Truly alone. Behind her, Thunderhawk was burning. Ahead of her, 620 Marines were dying. And somewhere in the chaos, her brother was waiting for a rescue that command had already decided would never come. She checked her ammunition. 14 rounds remaining in her magazine. For more magazines in her pack. 62 shots to cross a valley full of enemies. Eliminate a Taliban commander and save a battalion. She started moving again. There was no other choice. The silence in her earpiece was worse than gunfire. Yara had grown accustomed to Resnick's voice over the past 18 months. His observations delivered in that flat tone that somehow managed to convey both professionalism and dark humor. Now there was nothing, just the static hiss of a dead channel and the distant sounds of a battle she could no longer see. She moved through a narrow ravine, her boots finding purchase on stones that shifted with every step. The sun was climbing higher now, burning off the morning chill and replacing it with the dry heat that made Helmand Province feel like the surface of another planet. She had maybe 2 hours before the temperature became a factor. 2 hours before dehydration and exhaustion started eating away at her effectiveness. 2 hours to cover another 1.5 kilometers of enemy territory. The ravine opened onto a plateau that overlooked the main valley. Yara dropped to her stomach and crawled to the edge, pulling her rifle up beside her. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. The ambush was even worse than she had imagined. The patrol's vehicles were scattered across the valley floor like broken toys, some of them still burning, others riddled with holes that caught the sunlight. She counted bodies. Too many bodies. Marines in desert camouflage, lying motionless in positions that spoke of desperate last stands and futile attempts at cover. But there was movement too. Near the center of the kill zone, a cluster of rocks had become a makeshift fortress. She could see muzzle flashes from behind the stones. Someone was still fighting. She adjusted her scope, scanning the defensive position. 12 Marines, maybe 15. They had formed a perimeter around the rocks, using the bodies of the fallen and the wreckage of the vehicles as additional cover. It was not enough. The Taliban had them surrounded on 3 sides, pouring fire into the position from elevated ground. The Marines were returning fire, but their ammunition would not last forever. Nothing lasted forever out here. Yara searched for Tobias among the defenders. She found him on the eastern edge of the perimeter, his rifle braced against a shattered engine block. He was alive, wounded, judging by the way he favored his left side, but alive and fighting. Relief flooded through her, so intense it made her hands shake. She forced herself to breathe, forced herself to focus. Her brother was alive, but he would not stay that way unless she did something about the enemy positions that were slowly grinding down the Marine defenses. She counted the threats. 8 fighters on the northern ridge, 6 more on the western slope. Another group, maybe 10 or 12, moving through a gully to the south. They were positioning for a final assault. Coordinated. Professional. This was not random insurgent activity. This was a planned operation led by someone who understood tactics. Qasim Rashidi, the patient one. She had read the intelligence briefs on him. Former Afghan army, trained by the Soviets before switching sides after an American airstrike killed his family. He had spent 15 years perfecting the art of the ambush, and now 620 Marines were caught in his masterpiece. Yara did the math. 24 confirmed enemies in direct engagement positions. Probably more she could not see. 62 rounds in her possession. Even if every shot was a kill, she would run out of ammunition before she ran out of targets. And that assumed no misses, no malfunctions, no unexpected complications. She needed to change the equation. She needed to think like Rashidi. What did the enemy commander want? He wanted to destroy the patrol. He wanted to draw reinforcements from Thunderhawk into a second ambush. He wanted to demonstrate that the Americans could be beaten, that their technology and training meant nothing against patience and preparation. Everything about this operation was designed to maximize both casualties and propaganda value, which meant he was watching. Somewhere out there, Rashidi was observing his creation, waiting for the perfect moment to order the final assault. Find him, eliminate him, and the coordination that made this ambush so deadly would fall apart. Yara scanned the ridge lines, looking for the command position. A good commander would want elevation and a clear view of the entire battlefield. He would want communication with all his units. He would want an escape route in case things went wrong. There, a compound on the eastern ridge, partially concealed by rock formations. She could see movement on the roof. Multiple figures, antennas that suggested radio equipment. It was at least 800 meters from her current position, across open ground that offered almost no cover. She would have to circle around, approach from the north, use the terrain to mask her movement until she was close enough for a clean shot. It would take hours, hours that the Marines in the valley did not have. A burst of gunfire from the kill zone pulled her attention back to the defensive position. One of the Marines had broken cover, trying to reach a wounded comrade who had fallen in the open. Taliban rounds kicked up dust around his feet as he ran. Yara watched through her scope, her finger tightening on the trigger even though she knew the angle was wrong, knew she could not help from this position. The Marine reached his fallen brother, grabbed him by the vest, started dragging him back toward the rocks. A bullet caught him in the shoulder, and he stumbled but did not fall. Another round struck the ground inches from his feet. He kept moving, kept pulling, and then he was behind the rocks again, collapsing beside the man he had saved. Yara recognized him. Corporal Elijah St. Clair. She had shared a meal with him 2 weeks ago, listened to him talk about his daughter back in Louisiana, about how she was learning to read, and had started writing him letters that he carried everywhere. He was 26 years old, and he had just done something incredibly brave and incredibly stupid, because that was what Marines did for each other. She could not let them die. She could not spend hours circling around to find Rashidi, while the people she had sworn to protect were slaughtered in a valley that should never have become a kill zone. New plan. She studied the enemy positions again. The fighters on the northern ridge were the most immediate threat. They had the best angle on the Marine defensive position, and they were pouring the heaviest fire into the rocks. If she could eliminate them, she would buy the defenders time. Not much time, maybe an hour, but an hour might be enough. The problem was the approach. The northern ridge was 500 meters from her current position, across a stretch of broken ground that would leave her exposed for at least 300 of those meters. The enemy would see her coming. They would have time to react, time to reposition, time to kill her before she got close enough to matter. Unless they were distracted. Yara pulled a smoke grenade from her pack. She had 2 of them, saved for emergency extraction scenarios. This qualified. She calculated the wind direction, the drift pattern, the amount of time the smoke would provide concealment. 30 seconds, maybe 45. It would have to be enough. She armed the grenade and threw it as far as she could toward the western slope. The canister bounced twice and then erupted in a plume of red smoke that began drifting across the valley floor. The Taliban fighters on the western slope started shouting. Some of them shifted position, trying to see through the haze. For a moment, the fire directed at the Marine position slackened. Yara ran. She covered the first 200 meters before anyone realized what was happening. The red smoke was spreading, creating confusion, drawing attention away from the lone figure sprinting across the broken ground. She was fast. She had always been fast. Her instructors at Paris Island had clocked her mile time and asked if she had considered track and field instead of combat arms. 300 meters. She could see the enemy fighters on the northern ridge now, their backs to her, as they tried to make sense of the smoke and shouting. One of them turned, spotted her, raised his weapon. Yara fired from the hip. Not a clean shot, not a sniper shot, but close enough. The man went down, and she kept running, closing the distance, her rifle coming up to her shoulder as the remaining fighters scrambled to respond. She killed 4 of them in 6 seconds. The others broke and ran, disappearing over the ridge line before she could line up another shot. She let them go. She had bought the Marines their hour. From her new position, she could see the kill zone clearly, could see Tobias and St. Clair and the other survivors huddled behind their makeshift fortress, could see the enemy regrouping on the western slope, preparing for another push. And she could see something else, something that made her blood turn to ice. On the eastern ridge, near the compound she had identified as the command post, a group of fighters was loading something onto a truck, something large and cylindrical, something that looked very much like a rocket launcher. They were not planning a final assault. They were planning annihilation. Yara checked her ammunition. 53 rounds remaining. The compound was still 800 meters away, and she was out of smoke grenades. The rocket launcher changed everything. Yara watched through her scope as the enemy fighters finished loading the weapon onto the truck bed, their movements careful and practiced. They had done this before, probably in other valleys, against other patrols, in ambushes that had ended with nothing but smoking craters and body parts too scattered to identify. She had maybe 20 minutes before they got that launcher into position. 20 minutes before the rocks that were keeping the Marines alive became their tomb. She needed to move. Now, the path to the eastern ridge would take her through a section of the valley she had not yet scouted. Unknown terrain, unknown enemy positions, unknown everything. Every instinct she had developed over 10 years of military service screamed that this was a mistake. You did not advance into unknown territory without intelligence. You did not abandon a defensible position for open ground. You You did not charge toward a fortified compound alone with 53 rounds and no backup. But the alternative was watching her brother die. Yara moved. She dropped from the northern ridge and cut across the valley floor, using the scattered wreckage of the patrol vehicles as cover. The burned-out hulk of a Humvee, the twisted frame of a supply truck, a crater where something had exploded with enough force to turn sand into glass. She passed bodies as she moved. Marines she had known, Marines she had trained with, Marines who had eaten breakfast that morning without any idea that they would never eat again. She did not let herself look at their faces. She could not afford to. The compound grew larger in her vision as she approached. It sat on a natural shelf of rock that jutted out from the ridge, surrounded by a low wall that had probably been built generations ago by shepherds trying to keep their flock safe from wolves. Now, it sheltered a different kind of predator. She counted 6 fighters visible on the wall. More inside, probably. And somewhere among them, Qasim Rashidi, the man who had turned this valley into a slaughterhouse. She was 500 meters from the compound when she found the radio. It was lying in the dirt beside a dead Taliban fighter, the kind of handheld unit that insurgent forces use for short-range communication. The fighter had taken a round through the chest, probably from one of the Marines in the initial exchange. His blood had soaked into the sand around him, turning it the color of rust. Yara picked up the radio and turned it on. Static at first, then voices, speaking Pashto, which she did not understand, but the tone was clear enough. Urgent, commanding, coordinated. She listened for a moment, trying to pick out patterns, trying to learn anything that might help her understand what she was walking into. One voice stood out from the others. Calmer, more measured. It spoke less frequently, but when it did, the other voices went silent. That would be Rashidi. That would be the man she needed to kill. She clipped the radio to her vest and kept moving. 400 meters. The terrain was getting rougher now, forcing her to climb over rock formations that slowed her progress. The sun beat down on her back, and she could feel sweat soaking through her uniform. Her water supply was running low. She had maybe half a liter left, enough for another few hours if she was careful. But careful was not going to save the Marines in the valley. Only speed would do that. 300 meters. She could see the truck with the rocket launcher clearly now. The fighters had finished their preparations and were beginning to move the vehicle into position. They were taking it to a spot on the ridge that would give them a direct line of sight to the Marine defensive position. Once they got there, it would be over. 1 rocket, maybe 2, and 620 families back home would receive visits from officers in dress uniforms carrying news that no parent or spouse or child should ever have to hear. Yara found a position behind a boulder and raised her rifle. The truck was 250 meters away. The driver was visible through the windshield. She could take the shot, stop the vehicle, buy more time, but taking the shot would reveal her position. Every fighter in the compound would know exactly where she was. She would be pinned down, outnumbered, unable to reach Rashidi. The rocket launcher would be delayed, not stopped. They would simply find another way to get it into position. She needed a different approach. The radio on her vest crackled. The calm voice again, issuing what sounded like an order. A moment later, the truck began moving, not toward the ridge, but back toward the compound. They were repositioning, changing plans. Something had spooked them. Then she heard it, the distant thump of helicopter rotors. Yara looked up and saw them. 2 Black Hawks coming in from the east, flying low and fast. Air support. Someone at command had finally gotten their head out of their rear end and sent help. The helicopters were still several kilometers out, but they were coming. They were actually coming. The radio exploded with chatter. The calm voice was gone, replaced by something closer to panic. The fighters on the compound wall were pointing at the sky, shouting to each other. The truck with the rocket launcher had stopped moving entirely. This was her chance. She broke from cover and sprinted toward the compound. 200 meters of open ground. If anyone was watching, if anyone had a clear shot, she was dead. But no one was watching. Every eye in the compound was fixed on the approaching helicopters, on the threat that was coming from the sky instead of the ground. 100 meters. She could see the gate now, a wooden door set into the stone wall. 2 fighters stood beside it, their attention on the Blackhawks. They did not see her coming. They did not see her raise her rifle. 2 shots. 2 bodies. The gate was unguarded. Yara hit the wall beside the door and pressed herself flat against the stone. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it over the helicopter rotors. Inside the compound, she could hear shouting. Footsteps. The sounds of men preparing to fight. She checked her ammunition. 14 rounds. The helicopters were closer now, close enough that she could see the door gunners scanning the terrain below. But something was wrong. They were not descending toward the valley. They were not moving to support the trapped Marines. They were circling, holding position, waiting for something. The radio crackled again. This time the voice spoke in accented English. American aircraft. This is Forward Operating Base Thunderhawk. You are ordered to hold position and await further instructions. Do not engage. Repeat, do not engage. Yara recognized the voice. Captain Aldrich Vance. He was calling off the air support. She stood there for a moment, unable to process what she was hearing. The helicopters had come. Help had arrived, and Vance was telling them to stand down, to watch from a distance while Marines died in the valley below. The calm voice returned to the radio. Pashto again, but the tone had changed. Confident now, almost amused. Rashidi had heard the transmission too. He knew the Americans were not coming. He knew the helicopters would circle uselessly while his men finished the job. Yara felt something cold settle into her chest. It was not fear. It was not despair. It was rage, pure and absolute, and more focused than anything she had ever felt in her life. Vance had known. He had known about this ambush before it happened. That was the only explanation. He had received intelligence, ignored it, sent the patrol anyway. And now he was making sure there were no survivors who could testify to his failure. She was going to kill Rashidi. She was going to save her brother. And then she was going to make sure Aldrich Vance answered for every single Marine who had died in this valley. Yara kicked open the gate and stepped into the compound. The compound was chaos. Yara moved through the gate and immediately dropped into a crouch, her rifle sweeping the courtyard. 3 fighters stood near a well in the center, their weapons pointed at the sky where the helicopters still circled like vultures waiting for something to die. They heard the gate slam against the wall and turned, confusion on their faces, try to understand why a lone American woman was standing in the middle of their fortress. Confusion bought her 2 seconds. 2 seconds was enough. She fired 3 times. 3 bodies hit the dust. She was already moving before the echo faded, sliding along the interior wall toward a doorway that led deeper into the compound. Shouts erupted behind her. Footsteps. The sharp crack of return fire that sent chips of stone spraying past her face. She ducked through the doorway and found herself in a narrow corridor. Mud walls, dirt floor, the smell of sweat and gunpowder, and something cooking in a room she could not see. This was not just a command post. People lived here. Families, maybe before Rashidi had turned it into a military installation. A fighter appeared at the far end of the corridor. Young, barely old enough to shave. He raised his rifle and Yara shot him through the chest before he could pull the trigger. He fell backward and did not move. 45 rounds. She stepped over the body and kept moving. The corridor branched left and right. She listened. Voices to the left, multiple speakers, the rapid chatter of men coordinating a response. To the right, silence. The silence drew her. Rashidi would not be in the chaos. Rashidi would be somewhere quiet, somewhere he could think, somewhere he could watch his masterpiece unfold. She went right. The corridor opened into a larger room, probably a gathering space in peacetime. Rugs on the floor, cushions piled against the walls. A low table holding maps and radio equipment. And standing at the window, his back to her, a man with gray-streaked hair and a posture that radiated absolute calm. Qasim Rashidi did not turn around when she entered. He simply stood there, looking out at the valley where Marines were dying according to his design. "You are the sniper," he said. His English was accented but clear. "I wondered when you would arrive." Yara kept her rifle trained on his back. "Turn around." "Why? So you can see my face when you kill me?" He shook his head slowly. I have been watching you, Sergeant, through the scope of my spotters, across the radio chatter of my men. You move like someone who has nothing left to lose. Turn around. Now. Rashidi turned. His face was weathered, lined with years and grief, and the kind of patience that came from losing everything and deciding to keep living anyway. His left hand was missing 2 fingers, old wounds that had healed into smooth stumps. His eyes met hers without fear. Your brother is in the valley, he said. The young one with the crooked helmet. He fights well. He will die well. Yara felt her finger tighten on the trigger. 1 shot, 1 bullet, and the man who had orchestrated this massacre would be gone. But Rashidi was still talking. Do you know why I chose this valley? This particular place, this particular day? He gestured toward the window. 15 years ago, American planes flew over a village 3 kilometers from here. They were looking for men like me. They found a wedding instead. 47 people, women, children, my wife, my son. They called it collateral damage. They called it regrettable. They did not call it murder, but that is what it was. Yara said nothing. Her rifle did not waver. I did not expect you to understand. Rashidi continued. You were the uniform. You follow the orders. You believe you are the heroes of this story. But there are no heroes in war, Sergeant. Only survivors and the dead. Today, I had hoped your people would join the dead. But you have complicated my plans. He smiled. It was not a cruel smile. It was almost sad. The rocket launcher, Yara said. Where is it going? Rashidi tilted his head. You know I will not tell you that. Then you know I'm going to kill you. Yes. He nodded slowly. I have known that since I saw you leave your position on the ridge. A woman willing to disobey orders, to cross a valley of death alone, to walk into an enemy compound with nothing but a rifle in her rage. Such a woman does not stop. Such a woman does not negotiate. She simply does what must be done. He took a step toward her. Yara held her ground. I have one request, he said. When you tell the story of this day, tell the truth. Tell them that Qasim Rashidi was not a monster. Tell them he was a father who lost everything and spent 15 years trying to make the people responsible feel what he felt. Tell them that war makes monsters of us all, and the only difference between us is which flag we die under. Yara looked at him, at the grief carved into his face, at the missing fingers on his left hand, at the calm acceptance in his eyes. She thought about the Marines in the valley, about Tobias, about the 47 people who had died at a wedding 15 years ago, about the way violence bred violence, generation after generation, an endless cycle of revenge and sorrow. Then she thought about the rocket launcher, about the men loading it onto a truck, about what would happen to 620 Marines if she stood here having a philosophical conversation instead of doing her job. I will tell them the truth, she said. I will tell them you were a man who chose to become a murderer because murder was done to you. I will tell them you had a chance to stop, to find another way, and you did not take it. And I will tell them that I killed you anyway, because some choices cannot be forgiven. She pulled the trigger. Rashidi fell. Yara stood over his body for a moment, watching the light fade from his eyes. There was no satisfaction in it. No triumph. Just the hollow feeling that always came after taking a life. The knowledge that something had ended that could never be restored. 44 rounds. The shouts outside were getting louder. Rashidi's men had heard the shot. They were coming. She searched the room quickly, looking for anything that might tell her where the rocket launcher was heading. Maps on the table. Coordinates scrawled in handwriting she could not read. Radio frequencies. None of it meant anything to her. Then she found it. A photograph tucked beneath the maps. A young woman in a wedding dress, smiling at the camera. Beside her, a small boy, maybe 5 years old, clutching a flower. Rashidi's wife. Hashidi. Yara put the photograph back where she found it. She did not have time for guilt. She did not have time for doubt. She had to find that rocket launcher before it reached firing position. She moved to the window and looked out at the valley. The helicopters were still circling uselessly overhead. The Marines were still pinned down behind their rocks. The sun was climbing higher, and somewhere out there, a weapon capable of ending everything was being moved into position. Footsteps in the corridor. Close now. Very close. Yara turned from the window and raised her rifle. The doorway darkened as 3 fighters rushed through, their weapons already firing. The first bullet hit her in the left shoulder. She went down hard, her back slamming against the stone floor, her rifle clattering away from her grip. Pain exploded through her body, white-hot and blinding. She tried to reach for her sidearm, but her left arm would not respond. The fighters were advancing, their weapons trained on her, shouting words she could not understand. This is how it ends, she thought, in a room that smells like gunpowder and grief, surrounded by men who will never know my name. Then the wall exploded. Dust and debris filled the air. Yara rolled on her side, coughing, her wounded shoulder screaming in protest. Through the haze, she could see the 3 fighters who had been about to kill her. 2 were down, buried under chunks of stone and mud brick. The third was staggering, disoriented, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. She did not give him time to recover. Her right hand found her sidearm, and she fired twice from the floor. The fighter dropped. 42 rounds in the rifle, 13 in the pistol. The wall that had exploded was now a gaping hole opening onto the ridge outside. Through it, Yara could see the source of her salvation. One of the Black Hawks had broken formation. It was hovering just beyond the compound, its door gunner pouring fire into the enemy positions. Someone had disobeyed Vance's order. Someone had decided that watching Marines die was not an acceptable mission parameter. She forced herself to her feet, biting back a scream as her shoulder shifted. The bullet had gone clean through, missing the bone but tearing muscle and tissue. She could still move the arm, barely. She could still fight. That was all that mattered. The radio on her vest crackled. A new voice cutting through the chaos. Ground unit, this is Warrant Officer Priya Naidu. Call sign Valkyrie. I have eyes on your position. What is your status? Yara grabbed the radio with her good hand. Valkyrie, this is Sergeant Okonkwo. I am wounded but mobile. Enemy commander is down. Repeat, Rashidi is eliminated. Copy that, Sergeant. Excellent work. Be advised, I am operating against direct orders. We have maybe 10 minutes before Vance gets someone to pull us out of here. What do you need? The rocket launcher, Yara said. They are moving it into position to hit the Marines in the valley. I need to find it. A pause. Then Naidu's voice returned, tighter now. I see it. They have got on a truck, moving along the Eastern Ridge Road. Half a kilometer from your position. They will be in firing range in approximately 8 minutes. 8 minutes. Yara looked at the hole in the wall, at the ridge beyond, at the impossible distance between her and the weapon that would kill her brother. Can you hit the truck? Negative. The angle is wrong, and they have got RPGs trained on us. If I get any closer, they will take us down. You're the only one who can reach it in time. Of course she was. Of course it came down to her, wounded and exhausted and running out of ammunition, sprinting toward a target she might not be able to stop. She retrieved her rifle from the floor and checked the action. Still functional. She moved toward the hole in the wall, then stopped. Valkyrie, the order to stand down. Who gave it? Captain Aldrich Vance, Thunderhawk Actual. Did he say why? Another pause. Longer this time. When Naidu spoke again, her voice was careful. He said the situation was contained. He said air support was not authorized for this engagement. He said any pilot who violated that order would face court-martial. Yara closed her eyes. Contained. 620 Marines pinned down in a kill zone, and Vance had called it contained. Valkyrie, after this is over, I need you to remember something. Captain Vance received intelligence about this ambush before it happened. He knew, and he sent the patrol anyway. Silence on the radio. Then, very quietly, how do you know that? Because I saw the briefing report on his desk 2 days ago. I did not understand what it meant at the time, but it described this valley. It described the enemy positions. It described everything that happened today. She had not been certain until she said it out loud. But now the pieces were falling into place. The route that Resnick had questioned, Vance's insistence that it was secure, the way he had sealed the perimeter instead of sending reinforcements, the order to keep the helicopters back. He was not just incompetent. He was covering his tracks. Naidu's voice came back, hard as steel. "Get to that launcher, Sergeant. Stop it. And when this is over, I will testify to everything you just told me." "Copy that, Valkyrie. Okonkwo out." She climbed through the hole in the wall and started running. The Eastern Ridge Road was little more than a dirt track carved into the mountainside. Yara could see the dust plume from the truck, maybe 400 meters ahead, winding along the curves, moving inexorably toward the firing position. Her shoulder throbbed with every step. Her lungs burned. Her legs felt like they were filled with sand instead of muscle. She ran anyway. 300 meters. The truck had stopped. Through her scope, she could see fighters jumping from the bed, setting up the launcher on its tripod. They were working fast, professional, racing against the clock just like she was. 200 meters. One of the fighters spotted her and raised his weapon. She dropped to one knee, ignoring the agony that shot through her body, and fired. The man fell. The others scattered, taking cover behind the truck. 100 meters. She was close enough now to see the launcher clearly. Soviet-era design, probably left over from the occupation. Old but functional. One rocket already loaded, two more waiting beside it. Enough firepower to turn the Marine defensive position into a crater. The fighters behind the truck opened fire. Bullets kicked up dirt around her feet, whined past her ears, snapped through the air like angry insects. She kept moving, kept closing the distance, kept firing. 38 rounds. 50 meters. A bullet grazed her thigh, opening a line of fire across her leg. She stumbled, but did not fall. Another round punched through her vest, stopped by the ceramic plate, but hitting hard enough to crack ribs. She gasped, tasted blood, kept moving. 35 rounds. 20 meters. She could see the fear in their eyes now. They had expected air support or ground forces or some kind of coordinated assault. They had not expected a single wounded woman walking through their gunfire like death itself had taken human form. She killed two more of them. The others broke and ran, disappearing down the ridge road. She let them go. She did not have ammunition to waste on fleeing enemies. The launcher stood unattended, its rocket pointed at the valley below. Yara limped toward it, her vision blurring at the edges, her body running on nothing but adrenaline and rage. She reached the launcher and looked down at the Marine position. From here, she could see everything. The rocks where the survivors were huddled. The bodies scattered across the valley floor. The distant shape of Thunderhawk, smoke still rising from the perimeter. And she could see Tobias, still fighting, still alive. She grabbed the launcher and turned it. The mechanism was simple enough, designed for soldiers with minimal training. She pointed it away from the Marines toward an empty stretch of mountainside and pulled the trigger. The rocket screamed across the valley and exploded against bare rock. Harmless. Wasted. She loaded the second rocket and fired it the same way. Then the third. When the launcher was empty, she sat down beside it and let herself breathe. The radio crackled. Valkyrie's voice, triumphant. "Sergeant Okonkwo, I have visual confirmation. Launcher is neutralized. The Marines are safe." Yara looked down at the valley, at the survivors who would live because she had refused to follow orders, at the brother who would come home because she had decided that some things mattered more than protocol. "Copy that, Valkyrie," she said. "Now let us go get our people." The sun was directly overhead when Yara started down the ridge toward the valley. Every step sent fresh waves of pain through her body. The shoulder wound had started bleeding again, soaking through the field dressing she had applied with shaking hands. The graze on her thigh burned like someone had pressed a hot iron against her skin. Her cracked ribs made breathing feel like swallowing glass. None of it mattered. The Marines were still trapped, and she was the only one who could reach them. Valkyrie had pulled back to refuel and rearm, promising to return with whatever support she could muster. The other Black Hawk had followed Vance's orders and retreated to Thunderhawk, its crew either unwilling or unable to defy a direct command. That left Yara alone on the ridge, looking down at a valley that had become a graveyard. She counted the enemy positions as she descended. The fighters who had fled from the launcher had not gone far. She could see them regrouping on the western slope, maybe 20 of them, leaderless now, but still dangerous. Without Rashidi's coordination, they had fallen back on instinct. They were preparing for a final push, one last assault to finish what their commander had started. She had 35 rounds, 20 enemies. The math was better than it had been, but still not good. The rocks where the Marines had made their stand were maybe 300 meters from her current position. She could see movement behind the stones, figures shifting and repositioning. They were still fighting, still holding, but their ammunition had to be running low by now, and some of them were clearly wounded. She saw one Marine dragging himself across the ground, leaving a dark trail in the sand behind him. Another was slumped against a boulder, not moving at all. Yara picked her way down the slope, using the terrain for cover. The enemy fighters on the western slope had not spotted her yet. Their attention was focused on the Marine position, on the prize that had been denied them for hours, but was finally within reach. She was 200 meters from the rocks where she heard the voice. Yara. She froze. The voice had come from somewhere to her left, weak and ragged, but unmistakable. She turned and saw him. A Marine, lying in a shallow depression between two boulders. His uniform was soaked with blood, and his right leg was bent at an angle that made her stomach turn. But his eyes were open, and they were fixed on her face with something like recognition. She moved toward him, staying low, her rifle ready. As she got closer, she realized she knew him. Corporal Elijah St. Clair, the man from Louisiana who had risked his life to save a wounded brother earlier that morning. The man with a daughter who was learning to read. St. Clair, she said, dropping to her knees beside him. How bad? He tried to smile. It came out as a grimace. Pretty bad, Sergeant. Took one in the gut about an hour ago. Crawled here to get out of the crossfire. Been watching you come down the ridge. Thought I was hallucinating. She checked his wound. Abdominal. Serious. He needed a surgeon within the next few hours, or he was not going to make it. She pulled a pressure bandage from her kit and applied it as gently as she could, but he still gasped in pain. The others, he said through gritted teeth. How many made it? I do not know yet. Yara finished securing the bandage and looked toward the rocks. I'm going to find out. St. Clair grabbed her arm with surprising strength. Your brother. I saw him. Maybe an hour ago. He was still fighting. Took charge after Lieutenant Harmon went down. Kid is tougher than he looks. Something loosened in Yara's chest. Tobias was alive. Tobias was leading. Tobias was doing exactly what she had trained him to do, even though she had never wanted him to need that training. I'm going to get you out of here, she said. All of you. Just hold on. St. Clair released her arm and let his head fall back against the rock. I believe you, Sergeant. Go save the rest of them. I will be here when you get back. She wanted to stay with him. She wanted to tell him about his daughter, about how she was going to grow up knowing that her father was a hero. But there was no time for that. There was never enough time. She left him in the depression and kept moving toward the rocks. 100 meters. She could hear the gunfire clearly now, the sharp crack of Marine rifles answered by the deeper chatter of enemy weapons. The western slope was alive with muzzle flashes. The final assault had begun. Yara dropped to one knee and raised her rifle. The enemy fighters were advancing in short rushes, using the terrain for cover, moving closer to the Marine position with each push. She sighted on the lead fighter and fired. He dropped. The advance stuttered. She fired again. Another body fell. The fighter started looking around, trying to find the new threat. She was already moving, shifting position, making herself a ghost on the battlefield. 33 rounds. She killed 3 more before they spotted her. Bullets started cracking past her head, kicking up dust, forcing her to take cover behind a low ridge. The enemy had split their attention now, half focused on the Marines and half trying to suppress the sniper who had appeared on their flank. Good. That was exactly what she wanted. She popped up and fired twice more. 2 more kills. Then she was moving again, sliding along the ridge, appearing in a new position, making them think there was more than one shooter. 28 rounds. The Marine position had recognized the opportunity. Their fire intensified, coordinated volleys that caught the enemy in a crossfire. Fighters started falling back, their advance broken, their momentum lost. Yara kept shooting, kept moving, kept killing. By the time the enemy retreated to the western slope, She had expended 11 more rounds and counted at least 8 confirmed kills. The remaining fighters were regrouping at a distance, licking their wounds, trying to figure out what had just happened. She used the lull to cover the final distance to the Marine position. As she approached the rocks, a rifle swung toward her, then lowered as the Marine behind it recognized her uniform. "Sergeant Okonkwo," he said. His voice was hoarse, exhausted, but there was relief in it too. "We thought we were alone out here." "Not alone," she said, climbing over the rocks and dropping into the defensive position. "Never alone." The Marines around her were a ragged group. 14 survivors out of the 43 who had left Thunderhawk that morning. Most of them were wounded. All of them were running low on ammunition. But they were alive, and they were still fighting, and that was more than anyone had expected. Then she saw him. Tobias was crouched behind an overturned vehicle, his rifle trained on the western slope. His left arm was wrapped in a bloody bandage, and there was a gash across his forehead that had painted half his face red. But he was alive. He was breathing. He was here. He turned and saw her. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he was on his feet, crossing the distance between them, wrapping his good arm around her in a hug that made her wounded shoulder scream and her cracked ribs groan and her heart feel like it might burst from the sheer, overwhelming relief of holding her little brother and knowing he was going to survive. "You came," he said into her shoulder. "I knew you would come." She held him tighter. "Always," she said. "I will always come for you." They stood like that for a long moment, surrounded by death and chaos, and the distant sounds of enemies regrouping for another assault. Brother and sister, soldier and soldier, two people who had chosen this life and found each other in the middle of its worst day. Then Yara pulled back and looked him in the eye. "We're not done yet," she said. "We need to get everyone out of here before they come back." Tobias nodded, and the boy she had grown up with disappeared behind the Marine he had become. "Tell me what to do," he said. Yara took stock of what they had. 14 Marines, 9 of them wounded. 63 rounds of ammunition spread across the group. 2 functional radios, both with dying batteries. 1 smoke grenade that a lance corporal named Whitfield had been saving for an emergency. No vehículos, no air support, and maybe 30 enemy fighters regrouping on the western slope, preparing for another push. The math was not good, but the math had not been good all day, and she was still alive. "We cannot stay here," she said, addressing the group. "They will hit us again within the hour, and this time they will not stop until we are all dead. We need to move." "Move where?" The question came from a staff sergeant named Oduya, a thick-necked man with blood crusted along his jawline. "Thunderhawk is 3 kilometers north, and the enemy controls every route between here and there." "Not every route." Yara pulled up a mental map of the terrain, drawing on every patrol she had run in this valley over the past 6 months. "There's a dry riverbed that runs northeast from here. It curves around the western slope and comes out behind the enemy position. If we move fast and stay quiet, we can bypass them entirely. And if they spot us, then we fight. But fighting while moving is better than fighting while trapped." Oduya looked at her for a long moment. He outranked her by 1 grade, and under normal circumstances, he would be the one giving orders. But these were not normal circumstances. Everyone in this circle had watched her cross the valley alone, eliminate Rashidi, destroy the rocket launcher, and break the enemy assault single-handedly. Rank meant nothing compared to that. "All right, Sergeant," he said. "We do it your way. What do you need from us?" She organized them quickly. The walking wounded would help carry those who could not walk. Tobias and 2 other Marines with the most ammunition would take point. Yara would bring up the rear, covering their retreat. They would move in a single file, keeping noise to a minimum, stopping only if contact was unavoidable. Before they moved out, she pulled Tobias aside. "St. Clair," she said. "He's about 200 meters back the way I came, in a depression between 2 boulders. Gut wound. He cannot walk." Tobias's jaw tightened. "I will get him." "No, I need you on point." She looked toward the ridge where she had left the wounded corporal. "I will go back for him once the rest of you are moving. Catch up before you reach the riverbed." "Yara, that is insane. You're already wounded. If the enemy spots you alone out there, you are dead." She put her hand on his shoulder. Her little brother, who had grown into a man she barely recognized. A man who led when others fell. A man who would have made their father proud. I told him I would come back, she said. I do not break my promises. Tobias looked like he wanted to argue. Instead, he nodded once and turned to take his position at the front of the column. The group began to move. Yara watched them go, 14 figures limping and crawling and carrying each other through the rocks, heading toward a riverbed that might save their lives or might lead them straight into an ambush. Then she turned and started back up the slope. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across the valley floor. Yara moved through those shadows like a ghost, her rifle ready, her eyes scanning constantly for movement. The enemy had not yet realized that the Marine position was empty. They were still regrouping, still licking their wounds, still trying to figure out how a single sniper had shattered their assault. She found St. Clair where she had left him. His eyes were closed, and for a terrible moment she thought she was too late. Then his chest rose and fell, and she allowed herself to breathe. St. Clair. She knelt beside him, touching his face. Wake up. We are leaving. His eyes fluttered open. Took him a moment to focus. Sergeant, you came back. I told you I would. Can you move at all? He tried to sit up and immediately collapsed, gasping. Negative. Legs are not responding. Think something is pinched or severed. You're going to have to leave me. That is not happening. She looked at him, a man with a daughter who was learning to read, a man who had run into gunfire to save a wounded brother, a man who deserved to go home. I'm going to carry you, she said. It is going to hurt, but I need you to stay quiet no matter what. Can you do that? St. Clair managed a weak smile. I can do anything if it means seeing my little girl again. Yara positioned herself and lifted him across her shoulders in a fireman's carry. The weight sent agony screaming through her wounded shoulder, her cracked ribs, every part of her body that had been pushed past its limits. She bit down on her lip hard enough to draw blood and started walking. One step, then another, then another. The riverbed was maybe 400 meters away. 400 meters carrying a man who weighed at least 80 kilograms. 400 meters with enemies who could spot her at any moment. She made it 50 meters before she heard the shouts. The enemy had discovered the empty Marine position. She could hear them calling to each other, confusion giving way to anger as they realized their prey had escaped. It would not take them long to figure out where the Marines had gone. It would take them even less time to spot a lone woman carrying a wounded man across open ground. Yara moved faster. Her legs burned. Her lungs screamed. St. Clair was silent on her shoulders, honoring his promise, but she could feel his body trembling with the effort of not crying out. 300 meters. The riverbed was visible now, a dark scar cutting through the landscape. She could not see the other Marines, which meant they had already descended into the channel. Good. They were ahead of schedule. 200 meters. The shouting behind her was getting louder. Closer. They had found her trail. They were coming. 100 meters. She could hear footsteps now, the crunch of boots on rocky ground, multiple pursuers closing the distance. She was not going to make it. Not carrying St. Clair. Not at this pace. She stopped at the edge of the riverbed and looked down. A 4-meter drop to the sandy bottom. The other Marines were visible now, moving north along the channel, unaware of what was happening behind them. St. Clair, she said, this is going to be bad. Do it. She jumped. They hit the sand together, Yara twisting at the last moment to take the impact on her good shoulder. Pain exploded through her body, white and blinding and absolute. St. Clair groaned, but did not scream. She lay there for a moment, unable to move, unable to think, unable to do anything but exist in a universe of agony. Then she heard the voices at the top of the riverbed. She forced herself to move, grabbed St. Clair by his vest, and dragged him along the channel, away from the edge, into the shadows where the walls provided cover. Above her, she could hear the enemy fighters arguing. They had lost sight of her. They were not sure where she had gone. Yara pressed herself against the riverbed wall and held her breath. The voices continued for another minute. Then, slowly, they began to fade. The fighters were moving away, probably circling around to cut off the northern route. They did not know about the riverbed. They did not know where the Marines were actually heading. She waited until the silence was complete. Then she got St. Clair back on her shoulders and started moving north. The other Marines were waiting around a bend in the channel. Tobias saw her first, his face shifting from fear to relief to something that looked almost like awe. "I thought you were dead," he said. "Not yet." She lowered St. Clair to the ground, where two Marines immediately began checking his wounds. "Not yet." She looked at the group. 14 survivors. 15 now, counting St. Clair. All of them battered. All of them exhausted. All of them still alive because they had refused to give up. "How far to Thunderhawk?" Oduya asked. 2 kilometers, she said. "Maybe a little more. The riverbed will take us most of the way, but we will have to cross open ground for the last stretch." "And the enemy?" "Behind us for now, but they will figure out where we went eventually. We need to keep moving." No one argued. They formed up and started north, moving through the shadows of the riverbed like ghosts fleeing the scene of their own deaths. Yara took her position at the rear and followed. Her body was failing. Her ammunition was almost gone. But Thunderhawk was ahead, and her people were alive, and that was enough to keep her moving. It had to be enough. The riverbed ended without warning. One moment, they were moving through the shadowed channel, protected by walls of rock and sand. The next, the terrain opened up into a flat expanse of rocky ground that stretched for half a kilometer before reaching the perimeter of Thunderhawk. Yara called a halt and crawled to the edge of the riverbed, scanning the open ground with her scope. The base was visible in the distance, its walls scarred by the morning's attack, but still standing. She could see figures moving along the perimeter. Marines. Friendlies. Safety. Between them, and that safety was 500 meters of exposed terrain with no cover whatsoever. She swept her scope across the surrounding ridges. The enemy fighters who had been pursuing them were nowhere in sight, but that did not mean they were gone. Rashidi's men knew this valley. They knew every approach, every hiding spot, every place where an ambush could be sprung. If they had figured out where the Marines were heading, they would be waiting. Movement. Eastern Ridge. She focused on the spot and felt her stomach drop. At least 20 fighters were positioned along the high ground, their weapons trained on the open stretch between the riverbed and Thunderhawk. They had anticipated this. They had known the Marines would try to reach the base, and they had set up a kill zone to stop them. She pulled back from the edge and turned to face the group. 15 exhausted faces looked back at her, waiting for answers she was not sure she had. "They are waiting for us," she said. 20 plus on the eastern ridge. "The moment we step into the open, they will cut us down." Silence. The kind of silence that came when hope started to die. Staff Sergeant Oduya broke it first. "Can we go around? Find another route?" Yara shook her head. The riverbed does not extend any further, and the terrain to the west is too exposed. We would be in their sights even longer. What about waiting for dark? This from a young private whose name she did not know. His arm was in a makeshift sling, and his face was pale from blood loss. "We could move at night, use the darkness for cover. That is 6 hours away." Yara looked at St. Clair, who was barely conscious, and at 3 other Marines whose wounds were severe enough that waiting 6 hours might mean not waiting at all. "Some of us do not have 6 hours. More silence, the weight of the situation pressing down on all of them. Tobias moved to stand beside her. "What about the radio? Can we call for support?" She pulled the radio from her vest. 1 bar of battery remaining. Maybe enough for a single transmission. She keyed the mic and spoke. "Thunderhawk, this is Sergeant Okonkwo. Do you copy?" Static. Then, faint but clear, a familiar voice. "Okonkwo, this is Gunnery Sergeant Delgado. Where the hell are you?" Relief flooded through her. Delgado was alive. The base was still operational. "We are in the riverbed, 500 meters south of the perimeter. 15 survivors from the patrol. Multiple wounded. We have enemy fighters dug in on the eastern ridge. They have the approach covered. We cannot cross without support." A pause. She could imagine Delgado processing the information, running through options, try to find a solution. "Copy that, Sergeant." "Stand by." The radio went silent. Yara looked at the group. "We wait," she said. But we get ready to move. When that window opens, it is going to be small. They spent the next few minutes preparing, redistributing the remaining ammunition, checking weapons, helping the wounded into positions where they could be carried or supported. Yara moved among them, offering words of encouragement, checking bandages, doing everything she could to keep them focused on survival instead of fear. She was checking St. Clair's pulse when the radio crackled back to life. Okonkwo, this is Delgado. I have good news and bad news. Give me the good news first. Warrant Officer Naidu is back in the air. She has been raising hell with command, and she managed to get authorization for one extraction run. She is inbound to your position now, ETA 4 minutes. And the bad news? Captain Vance has ordered the base perimeter locked down. No ground support, no suppressing fire. You're going to have to cross that open ground on your own while Naidu tries to keep the enemy's heads down. Yara closed her eyes. Of course Vance would not help. Of course he would leave them to die, even when they were within sight of safety. He had already written them off once today. Why would he change now? Copy that, Delgado. We will be ready. One more thing, Sergeant. Delgado's voice dropped lower. When you get back, we need to talk. I have been doing some digging. The intelligence report that predicted this ambush. I found out who received it and when. Vance knew. He knew 3 days ago, and he buried it. Yara felt the cold rage settle back in her chest. The same rage that had carried her across the valley, through the compound, past the rocket launcher. The rage that had kept her moving when her body had every reason to stop. I know, she said, and when this is over, he is going to answer for it. She ended the transmission and turned to the group. We have air support coming in 4 minutes. One helicopter is going to make a run at the enemy position and try to suppress their fire. When that happens, we move. Everyone who can walk helps everyone who cannot. We do not stop until we reach that perimeter. Understood? Nods. Murmurs of acknowledgement. 14 Marines and 1 sergeant preparing to make a final run through hell. Tobias appeared at her side. His rifle was ready, his jaw set, his eyes carrying the same determination she saw in the mirror every morning. Together? He asked. Together, she said. They waited. The longest 4 minutes of Yara's life. She watched the eastern ridge, counting enemy positions, calculating angles, trying to figure out how to get 15 people across 500 meters of open ground while being shot at by 20 fighters on elevated terrain. Then she heard it, the distant thump of rotor blades. Valkyrie appeared over the southern ridge, coming in fast and low. The helicopter banked hard, its door gunner already opening fire on the enemy positions. Tracers streaked across the sky like angry fireflies. The fighters on the eastern ridge scrambled for cover, their attention pulled away from the riverbed. Now, Yara shouted, "Move, move, move." They surged out of the riverbed. 15 people running, limping, crawling, carrying each other across open ground. Yara stayed at the rear, her rifle up, firing at any enemy who tried to break from cover. 17 rounds. 16. 15. Valkyrie made another pass, raking the ridge with fire. An explosion bloomed among the enemy positions as a fuel canister or ammunition cache caught around. Fighters scattered, their coordination shattered. 300 meters to go. Yara saw a muzzle flash on the ridge and fired back. The shooter dropped. 14 rounds. 200 meters. The perimeter was close now. She could see Delgado at the gate, waving them forward, shouting orders that were lost in the chaos. An enemy round caught Whitfield in the leg, and he went down. Tobias was there instantly, hauling the lance corporal up, half carrying him towards safety. 100 meters. Valkyrie swooped overhead, so close Yara could feel the rotor wash. Naidu's voice crackled over the radio. 30 seconds of fuel. Make it count. Yara turned and fired 3 more rounds at the ridge, forcing a group of fighters back into cover. 11 rounds. 50 meters. The gate was open. Marines from the base were rushing out to help, grabbing the wounded, pulling them inside. 20 meters. Tobias crossed the threshold with Whitfield. Odia followed, then the others one by one. 10 meters. Yara was the last one. She walked backward, her rifle still trained on the ridge, watching for any final threat. 5 meters. She crossed the perimeter. The gate slammed shut behind her. For a moment, she just stood there, breathing, bleeding, alive. Then Delgado was in front of her, gripping her shoulders, looking at her with something between disbelief and wonder. 15 survivors, Delgado said. You brought back 15. Yara looked at the Marines around her. Wounded, exhausted, but breathing. We all brought each other back, she said, and then her legs gave out, and the world went dark. Yara woke to the sound of machines beeping and the smell of antiseptic. She was lying in a hospital bed, her shoulder wrapped in clean bandages, and 4 dripping fluid into her arm. The ceiling above her was white and unfamiliar. She tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. Pain lanced through her ribs, her shoulder, her thigh. Every part of her body seemed determined to remind her of what she had put it through. Easy, Sergeant. A nurse appeared at her bedside, gently pressing her back down. You have been out for almost 2 days. Your body needs rest. 2 days. Yara stared at the ceiling, processing. 2 days since the valley. 2 days since she had carried St. Clair through enemy territory. 2 days since she had walked 15 Marines through a kill zone and collapsed at the finish line. Where am I? Camp Leatherneck. They flew you out on a medevac 12 hours after you reached Thunderhawk. You needed surgery on that shoulder. The doctors say you will make a full recovery, but it is going to take time. The others, the survivors from the patrol, are they okay? The nurse hesitated. Most of them are here, being treated. A few were sent to Landstuhl for more serious injuries. St. Clair? He made it. Surgery was touch and go, but he pulled through. He's been asking about you. Yara closed her eyes and let herself breathe. St. Clair was alive. The others were alive. Whatever came next, at least she had accomplished that much. The nurse checked her vitals and adjusted the 4 before leaving. Yara lay there in the silence, staring at the ceiling, letting her mind drift through the fragments of memory from the valley. Rashidi's calm voice. The photograph of his wife and son. The rocket launcher pointed at her brother. Vance's order to stand down. Vance. She was still thinking about him when the door opened and gunnery Sergeant Delgado walked in. Delgado looked like she had not slept in days. There were dark circles under her eyes, and her uniform was wrinkled in ways that would normally be unacceptable. But her expression was sharp, focused, carrying something that looked almost like anticipation. You are awake, Delgado said, pulling a chair to the bedside. Good. We need to talk. What happened while I was out? Delgado glanced at the door, then lowered her voice. Vance filed charges against you. Desertion, insubordination, disobeying a direct order. He is pushing for a court-martial. Yara had expected this. From a moment she had decided to leave her position on the ridge, she had known this was coming. You cannot disobey orders and expect the system to look the other way, no matter how many lives you saved. What about the survivors? She asked. Their testimony? That is where it gets interesting. Delgado leaned forward. Vance tried to keep them isolated. Separate rooms, no visitors, no communication with each other. He wanted to control the narrative. But Warrant Officer Naidu got to them first. Naidu, she's been busy, talking to everyone who was in that valley, recording statements, building a case. Delgado paused. She also managed to get her hands on the intelligence report, the one that predicted the ambush, the one Vance received 3 days before he sent the patrol into that kill zone. Yara felt her heart rate increase. The machines beside her bed beeped faster in response. How? Vance is not as careful as he thinks he is. He deleted the report from the official database, but he forgot about the backup servers. Naidu has a complete copy. Timestamps, distribution lists, everything. He knew, Yara said. He knew and he sent them anyway. It gets worse. Delgado's expression darkened. The report did not just predict an ambush. It identified Rashidi as the commander. It detailed his tactics, his preferred terrain, his pattern of targeting American patrols. Vance had everything he needed to cancel that mission or at least change the route. He chose not to. Why? Why would he do that? Delgado was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I have a theory. Vance's father is General Harrison Vance. Retired now, but still connected. Still influential. The Vance family has a reputation to protect. Aldrich has been on a fast track to promotion his entire career, and he has never had a mark on his record. So he buried the report to avoid looking incompetent? I think he buried the report because he did not believe it. He thought his judgment was better than the intelligence analysts. And when the ambush happened, when everything went wrong, he could not admit that he had made a mistake. So he sealed the perimeter, called off the air support, tried to let the evidence die in that valley. Yara thought about the Marines who had not made it back. 28 men and women who had trusted their commanding officer to make good decisions. 28 families who would never see their loved ones again because one man's pride had been more important than their lives. What happens now? She asked. Now we fight. Delgado stood. Vance thinks he's going to railroad you in a quick court-martial before anyone can ask too many questions. But Naidu and I have been building a countercase. We have the intelligence report. We have testimony from 15 survivors. We have radio recordings from the helicopters showing that Vance ordered them to stand down while Marines were dying. And you think that will be enough? Delgado smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a woman who had spent 18 years in the Corps and had learned exactly how to navigate its politics. Mija, she said, by the time we are done, Aldrich Vance is not going to be court-martialing anyone. He is going to be the one answering questions. And I do not think he's going to like the answers he has to give. She moved toward the door, then stopped. One more thing. Your brother is outside. He has been waiting since you got out of surgery. I told him he could not come in until you were awake and stable. She paused. He looks just like you, you know. Same stubborn jaw. Same eyes that look like they were planning something. Send him in, Yara said. Delgado nodded and left. A moment later, the door opened again and Tobias walked in. He looked better than the last time she had seen him. His wounds had been treated, his arm properly bandaged, the gash on his forehead closed with neat stitches. But there was something different in his eyes. Something older. The look of a man who had seen things that would never fully leave him. He crossed the room and sat in the chair Delgado had vacated. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Tobias said, Mom called. She saw the news reports. Freaked out until I got her on the phone and told her we were both okay. What did you tell her? The truth. That her daughter is insane and also the bravest person I have ever known. Yara laughed, then winced as her ribs protested. Do not make me laugh. It hurts. Tobias reached out and took her hand. His grip was warm and solid and real. I never thank you, he said, for coming for us, for not giving up. You do not have to thank me. Yeah, you do. He squeezed her hand. I spent my whole life trying to be like you, trying to prove that I could do what you do. And then, in that valley, when everything fell apart, I finally understood something. What? Being brave is not about not being scared. It is about being terrified and doing what needs to be done anyway. He looked at her with those eyes that were so much like their father's. You taught me that. Not with words. With everything you did out there. Yara felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. She blinked them back. You did get out there too, she said. St. Clair told me you took command after Harmon went down. Said you kept them fighting when everyone else wanted to give up. I just did what you would have done. Then I taught you well. They sat together in the silence of the hospital room, brother and sister, soldiers and survivors. Outside, the machinery of military justice was beginning to turn. Vance was preparing his attack. Delgado and Naidu were preparing their defense. A reckoning was coming. But for now, in this moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was that they were alive. They were together. And whatever came next, they would face it the same way they had faced the valley. Side by side. The court-martial convened at Camp Leatherneck 2 weeks after the ambush. Yara sat at the defense table in her dress uniform, her shoulders still stiff beneath the fabric, watching the room fill with officers and officials who would decide whether she was a hero or a criminal. The chamber was austere. Gray walls, fluorescent lights, a panel of 5 officers seated behind a long table, their faces carefully neutral. Colonel Margaret Finn presided, a woman with silver hair and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Flanking her were 2 lieutenant colonels and 2 majors, each representing different branches and perspectives. At the prosecution table, Captain Aldrich Vance sat with a JAG lawyer, his uniform immaculate, his expression radiating confidence. He had spent the past 2 weeks positioning himself as the victim of an insubordinate sergeant who had endangered the mission and defied the chain of command. He had given interviews to military publications. He had spoken with his father's contacts in Washington. He had done everything possible to ensure that the narrative favored him. Yara had done none of those things. She had spent the 2 weeks recovering from her wounds and preparing for this moment. Colonel Finn called the proceedings to order and invited the prosecution to make its opening statement. The JAG lawyer stood. His name was Major Hendricks, a thin man with a precise voice that carried easily through the chamber. Members of the panel, he began, "This case is about discipline. It is about the chain of command. It is about what happens when a soldier decides that her judgment is more important than the orders of her superior officers." On the morning of October 17th, Sergeant Yara Okonkwo was given a direct order to maintain her position on the Overwatch Ridge and await extraction. Instead, she abandoned that position, entered enemy territory without authorization, and engaged in unauthorized combat operations that could have compromised the entire mission. Hendricks paused, letting the words settle. The defense will argue that Sergeant Okonkwo saved lives, that her actions were heroic. But heroism does not excuse insubordination. If every soldier decided to ignore orders whenever they disagreed with their commanding officer, our military would collapse into chaos. Discipline is not optional. It is the foundation of everything we do. He returned to his seat. Vance nodded slightly, satisfied. Colonel Finn turned to the defense table. "Your opening statement." Yara's lawyer was a captain named Diana Soto, a compact woman with sharp features and a reputation for winning cases that seemed unwinnable. She stood slowly, letting the silence build. "Members of the panel," she said, "this case is about leadership. It is about accountability. And it is about what happens when the chain of command fails the men and women who depend on it." She walked toward the panel, her voice steady. On the morning of October 17th, 620 Marines were left to die. Not by the enemy, by their own commanding officer. Captain Aldrich Vance received intelligence 3 days before the ambush that predicted exactly what would happen. He buried that intelligence. He sent a patrol into a kill zone, and when the ambush began, he sealed the perimeter, called off-air support, and left 43 Marines to be slaughtered. Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Colonel Finn silenced them with a look. "Sergeant Okonkwo did disobey orders," Soto continued. "She left her position. She crossed enemy territory alone. She killed the enemy commander who had orchestrated the ambush. She destroyed a rocket launcher that would have annihilated the survivors. And she led 15 Marines back to safety through a valley full of enemies who wanted them dead." Soto turned and looked directly at Vance. "The prosecution wants to talk about discipline. Let's talk about the discipline it takes to watch your brother and your fellow Marines dying and choose to act when your commanding officer has chosen to do nothing. Let's talk about the discipline it takes to carry a wounded man on your shoulders while enemy bullets crack past your head. Let's talk about the discipline it takes to be the last one through the gate, covering the retreat of everyone else when every instinct tells you to run." She faced the panel again. "This case is not about whether Sergeant Okonkwo disobeyed orders. She did. This case is about whether those orders were lawful, whether they were competent, whether following them would have meant being complicit in the deaths of 620 Marines." Soto returned to her seat. The chamber was silent. The prosecution called its witnesses. Vance himself took the stand first, describing in measured tones how he had made difficult decisions under pressure, how he had prioritized the safety of the base, how Sergeant Okonkwo's unauthorized actions had created chaos and confusion. Captain Soto cross-examined him with surgical precision. "Captain Vance, did you receive an intelligence report 3 days before the ambush predicting enemy activity in the valley?" Vance hesitated. "I receive many intelligence reports. Let me be specific." Soto held up a document. "This report, dated October 14th. detailing Taliban Commander Qasim Rashidi's presence in the region and his pattern of targeting American patrols. Did you receive this report? A longer hesitation. I may have. And what action did you take based on this report? I assessed the intelligence and determined that the patrol route was secure. You determined. Based on what expertise? I am a commanding officer. It is my responsibility to make those determinations. Soto nodded slowly. And when the ambush began exactly as this report predicted, in exactly the location this report identified, what did you do? I made tactical decisions to protect the base. You sealed the perimeter. You called off air support. You left 43 Marines in a kill zone with no reinforcement and no extraction. I made difficult decisions. Soto leaned forward. Did you make those decisions because you believed they were tactically sound? Or because you were afraid that survivors might ask why you ignored the intelligence that predicted this ambush? Objection. Hendricks was on his feet. Speculation. Withdrawn. Soto turned to the panel. No further questions. The defense called its witnesses. Warrant Officer Naidu described disobeying Vance's order to stand down because Marines were dying and someone had to help them. Gunnery Sergeant Delgado testified about finding the buried intelligence report and the timestamps proving Vance had received it. Staff Sergeant Odia described the moment Yara had appeared at the Marine defensive position, wounded and alone, and how her leadership had saved their lives. Then Corporal Elijah St. Clair took the stand. He was still recovering, moving slowly, but his voice was strong. I was gut-shot and bleeding out in a ditch, he said. I told Sergeant Okonkwo to leave me. I told her to save herself and the others. You know what she did? He looked at Yara, then at the panel. She picked me up and carried me. Across open ground. Through enemy fire. She jumped into a riverbed with me on her back because it was the only way to escape the fighters chasing us. And when we landed, when she must have been in agony from her own wounds, she got up and kept moving. She did not stop until I was safe. St. Clair's voice cracked. I have a daughter back home. She is 4 years old. She is learning to read. She writes me letters that I carry everywhere. The only reason I'm going to see her again is because Sergeant Okonkwo refused to leave a wounded Marine behind, even when leaving me was the smart thing to do. He wiped his eyes. You want to court-martial her for that? For saving my life? For saving all of us? Then you go right ahead. But I will spend the rest of my life telling everyone who will listen what she did in that valley. And history will remember her as a hero long after the rest of us are forgotten. The chamber was silent. Colonel Finn called a recess. The recess lasted 3 hours. When the panel reconvened, Yara noticed that Colonel Finn's expression had changed. The careful neutrality was gone, replaced by something harder, something that looked like judgment already rendered. Before we proceed, Colonel Finn said, I need to address a development that occurred during the recess. She looked at Vance. Captain Vance, please stand. Vance rose slowly. For the first time since the proceedings began, his confidence seemed uncertain. During the recess, Colonel Finn continued, I was presented with additional evidence. Radio communications between Captain Vance and the helicopter pilots on the morning of October 17th. These recordings were obtained by Warrant Officer Naidu and authenticated by our Signals Intelligence Division. She held up a transcript. In these communications, Captain Vance explicitly ordered air support to stand down while Marines were under fire and requesting immediate assistance. When asked for justification, he stated, and I quote, the situation is contained. Do not engage. Repeat, do not engage. The chamber was silent. Captain Vance, Colonel Finn said, the situation was not contained. 43 Marines were trapped in a kill zone. 28 of them died. And according to these recordings, you actively prevented the air support that might have saved them. Vance's lawyer rose. Colonel, this evidence was not submitted through proper channels. We have not had time to review or challenge it. The evidence is authenticated, Colonel Finn replied. And given its relevance to these proceedings, I am admitting it into the record. She paused. Additionally, I have received communication from the Inspector General's office. An investigation has been opened into Captain Vance's conduct before, during, and after the October 17th engagement. She looked at Vance with something close to contempt. Captain Vance, in light of this evidence, do you wish to continue prosecuting Sergeant Okonkwo for disobeying your orders? Or would you like to reconsider your position? The silence stretched. Vance looked at his lawyer. His lawyer looked at the table. Neither of them spoke. Very well, Colonel Finn said. She turned to the panel. Members of the panel, based on the evidence presented, I am recommending that all charges against Sergeant Yara Okonkwo be dismissed. Her actions on October 17th, while technically in violation of orders, were taken in response to a command failure of extraordinary magnitude. She displayed initiative, courage, and leadership that saved 15 lives and eliminated a significant enemy threat. She looked at Yara. Sergeant Okonkwo, please stand. Yara rose, her heart pounding. The charges against you are dismissed. Furthermore, based on the testimony of your fellow Marines and the documented record of your actions, I am recommending you for the Silver Star for gallantry in action against an enemy of the United States. The chamber erupted. Applause from a gallery where survivors from the patrol had gathered. Delgado was on her feet, tears streaming down her face. Tobias was beside her, clapping so hard his bandaged arm must have been screaming in protest. Yara stood motionless, unable to process what was happening. Colonel Finn raised her hand for silence. One more matter, she said. Captain Vance. Vance had not moved. He stood at the prosecution table, his face pale, his perfect composure finally shattered. You are hereby relieved of command pending the Inspector General's investigation. You will surrender your sidearm and remain confined to quarters until further notice. If the investigation finds evidence of negligent homicide, you will face a general court-martial. She paused. 28 Marines died under your command, Captain. Men and women who trusted you with their lives. Whatever happens next, you will carry that with you forever. Military police stepped forward and escorted Vance from the chamber. He did not look back. He did not look at Yara. He simply walked out, his career and his family's legacy crumbling with every step. The proceedings concluded. People surrounded Yara, shaking her hand, embracing her, thanking her. She moved through it all in a daze, accepting congratulations she still was not sure she deserved. She found Tobias waiting outside the chamber. He was leaning against the wall, watching her with a smile that reminded her of their father. Silver Star, he said, Mom is going to lose her mind. She probably already has. They walked together through the corridors of Camp Leatherneck, past Marines who stopped to salute, past officers who nodded with respect. Word had spread quickly. Everyone knew what had happened in that chamber. Everyone knew what Yara had done in the valley. They reached an outdoor courtyard and stopped. The sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. What now? Tobias asked. Yara thought about the question. She thought about the 28 Marines who would never see another sunset. She thought about Rashidi and the photograph of his wife and son. She thought about the endless cycle of violence that had brought them all to this place. Now we go home, she said. We heal. We remember the ones we lost. And then she looked at her brother, at the man he had become in the crucible of that valley. And then we keep going. We serve. We protect the people who cannot protect themselves. We try to make sure that what happened out there never happens again. Tobias nodded slowly. Sounds like a plan. They stood together in the fading light, brother and sister, survivors of something that should have killed them both. Behind them, the machinery of military justice was grinding forward, processing Vance's failures, documenting the truth of what had happened. Ahead of them, an uncertain future waited. But they were alive. They were together. And that was enough. If this story moved you, drop a comment and share your thoughts. Tell us about your favorite moment or character. Tell us if you know someone who showed this kind of courage when everything seemed lost. And if you have served, or if you have family who served, we honor your sacrifice. 3 months later, Yara stood in a ceremony at Marine Corps Base Quantico. Her mother was in the front row, crying and smiling at the same time. Tobias stood beside her in his dress uniform, his wounds healed, his chest already bearing a bronze star of his own. The commandant of the Marine Corps pinned the silver star to Yara's chest. The citation spoke of extraordinary heroism, of courage under fire, of actions above and beyond the call of duty. It spoke of 15 lives saved and an enemy commander eliminated. It spoke of everything she had done in that valley. It did not speak of the nightmares that still woke her some nights. It did not speak of the faces of the dead that she saw when she closed her eyes. It did not speak of the weight that she would carry for the rest of her life. But that was okay. Some things did not need to be spoken. Some things were understood by anyone who had been there. After the ceremony, Yara found a quiet moment alone. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the brass casing that hung on its thin chain. The casing from her first kill. The shot that had saved Tobias years ago and started her on the path that had led her here. She held it in her palm and thought about everything it represented. The lives she had taken, the lives she had saved, the choices she had made, and the consequences she would live with. Then she put it back around her neck, straightened her uniform, and walked back to her family. The past was behind her. The future was waiting. And Sergeant Yara Okonkwo was ready to face whatever came next.